Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by author and executive editor of the Libertarian Institute, Sheldon Richman, and we are discussing his essay collection, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. Sheldon, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we jump into the meat of your book, I just wanted to ask, you've been involved in the libertarian movement for such a long time. How were you first introduced to these ideas and to this movement?
Well, I have been longer than I like to remember, actually. I began to become aware. I hadn't heard the word libertarian yet, but my political awakening. I came from a Republican family, sort of moderate conservative. And my father voted for Nixon, probably. My mother probably voted for Nixon, although we were in a very democratic neighborhood in Philadelphia. But in 1964, as the Goldwater campaign was gearing up, I had an older brother who was very interested in it. And so I started seeing some of the literature and stuff that he had. So this is when I began hearing about it, really when I began thinking about political issues. But I'd always been a fan of fictional accounts of heroism in the American Revolution. There was a Disney show back then, and there were a couple different shows. But I sort of already liked that. I guess I was born a libertarian. This idea of fighting for freedom, individualism, it resonated. So as soon as I hear a goal, I realize a lot of younger people out there don't know anything about Barry Goldwater. But Goldwater did preach limited government, individual liberty, free enterprise. And that was like a dominant message on the domestic side. Now, looking back, and I didn't appreciate it at the time, he was very hawkish, right? He really wanted to roll back the Soviet Union. He didn't like the more accommodationist Eisenhower ideas of just, living, Cold War, but not trying to roll them back. So he was much more, aggressive. And I wasn't thinking much about foreign policy then, but it was the beginning of my thinking about, believe in individual liberty, government ought to be really limited and it shouldn't get in people's way. And I remember even being against censorship back then. So that was the beginning of it. I had a Goldwater bumper sticker on a book. So this was 64. So I was 14 and turned 15 until the end of the year. But in school, I ran into people who said, well, if you like Goldwater, you really ought to read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. I'd never heard of that before. So I said, okay, that sounds interesting. And then they said, another thing you ought to do is get on the mailing list of the Foundation for Economic Education. They put out a little monthly magazine, and I'm showing my hands here for your benefit, a little monthly magazine called The Freeman. Little did I know that many years later, I would edit The Freeman. I would spend 15 years editing The Freeman from the late 90s into the 2000s. Only a dream. I didn't even dream of it. So I did, and they said, once you put your name on FEE, it was called FEE, right? The Foundation for Economic. Once you put your name on their mailing list, you don't even have to pay anything. You'll get mail from them. That's just how they operated. So I guess I immediately did that, and so I start reading, and they had basic level articles about free markets and individual liberty, but they were by people like Hazlitt, but also Mises, and a guy named Percy Graves, a whole bunch of different people whose names I would come to really appreciate as time went on. So that was the beginning. And then it was inevitable that somebody in high school said, have you read Ayn Rand? I said, who's Ayn Rand? I said, oh, you got to read Ayn Rand. So the first thing I read by Ayn Rand was not even fiction. I read For a New Intellectual. Well, actually, that was excerpts from the novels, but an opening essay too, nonfiction essay called For the New Intellectual. But then I went on from there to read The Fountainhead and slowly read Atlas Shrugged. I mean, it's a thick book. Finally got around to reading Atlas Shrugged. Then I began to hear the word libertarian. I was meeting Philadelphia libertarians. And so you get exposed to, you hear the name Rothbard, and you start reading essays by Rothbard. Then you realize he's got, lots of books, including a thick economic treatise called Man, Economy, and State. And, it's just from there. That's a very typical story for people my age. I know libertarians are roughly my age, and their stories very, very similar. Goldwater was like an awakening. He was not a libertarian, But he did have as a chief speechwriter Karl Hess, who then went on to
Yeah.
become a major libertarian. He wouldn't have considered him a libertarian back then. He would have called himself a conservative, and he became more radical in the libertarian sense.
Did he write Goldwater's famous line about defense in defense of
I actually
extremism?
don't
And
think he did. That was the legend for a long time, but I think I heard that someone else did it. But yeah,
disappointing.
yeah, because Goldwater was being declared an extremist even in his own party by
Yeah.
Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of New York, who wanted the nomination in '64, and also Mitt Romney's father, George Romney. Those were like major Republican players, and they wanted the presidential nomination. And Goldwater, who was a pretty consistent defender of what he thought were constitutional limits. I mean, he talked about it a lot, and lots of people didn't talk about it. They called him, therefore, an extremist. That didn't mean he advocated the violence. It just meant he tried to be consistent. And so that line that you referred to, which was extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Very famous line at his acceptance speech in San Francisco at the GOP convention. But that was obviously an answer to the so-called moderate Republicans who were trying to condemn it as a extremist. Now, of course, he lost very badly to Lyndon Johnson. You know, JFK had been assassinated the year before Kennedy, and it's probably the case that no one was going to defeat Johnson. But it was one of the worst landslides, I guess, in history. It was really pretty bad. But Hess wrote a book called In a Cause That Will Triumph after that election. And I don't think he had quite become a libertarian yet, but he became a hardcore libertarian. I knew him personally, got to know him, and he actually became affiliated with the Libertarian Party, was editing their newspaper at one point. So that's kind of my story. And I've never gotten out of the movement ever since.
Yeah, you say it's typical of libertarians around your age, and I think, I mean, Goldwater aside, some of the intellectual influences, some of the writers you talk about, I mean, that story stayed consistent, I think, for a long time after. I don't know if it's not exactly my story. You know, I'm younger than you. I'm around 40, but I remember thinking about these ideas and some of them just feeling intuitive to me early on, and then it crystallizing when I actually went out and trying to read people who were writing like this. I was like, does anybody actually think this? Because I didn't feel like I fit in with Democrats or Republicans. And I think one of the first things I remember reading, like real libertarian literature, was actually Alan Greenspan. It was his essay Antitrust in Ayn Rand's collection, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Because that objection kept occurring to me. But what about, you know, free markets may be great, but what if one company gets so powerful it dominates the economy? And I was worried about monopolies. And so I found this essay called Antitrust, and I thought it was very persuasive. And then I read the rest of that book, and then I did the thing that everyone does. They follow Rand's footnotes to Mises. And my first introduction to Mises was his book Socialism, which was probably way too big and advanced for me to try to dive into.
Second only to Human Action in length.
Yes.
And intimidation.
But it was inspiring nonetheless.
Yep. A very important book, yes. And Mises, he's one of the greats of the 20th century. I mean, it's too bad that he's not appreciated outside of, you know, Austrian economists and libertarians. They didn't give Hayek the Nobel Prize until the year after Mises died. I don't know if there was any connection between those two things, but maybe they were already considering Hayek, but didn't want to give it to Hayek when Mises was still alive. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It is interesting.
He's increased in popular appeal, and, you know, as a result of so many people being inspired by him indirectly, if nothing else. There's a car that's always parked near my house, and it has the Mises emblem bumper sticker on it. And I drive by it all the time thinking, like, I would have never expected to see that 10, 15 years ago or something.
Yeah. Of course, there's the Institute in Auburn that keeps the name alive.
Yes.
I watch plenty of their economics lectures on YouTube because they're doing, you know, every year they're doing seminars, and I like to see the younger Austrians go through, you know, socialist calculation and the business cycle and the subjective value, marginal value. I still learn by hearing these lectures. I'm not a professional economist. I didn't get a PhD in economics, so there's a lot that I have never read that a PhD student or somebody with a PhD would have had to read in their program. I'm not just talking about Austrian economics. I mean, just generally economics. So I'm an amateur. And so I have a lot to learn from people like, Robert Murphy, and you could name a whole bunch, Peter Klein, you could name a lot of people.
Well, very insightful, amateur. And someone wrote an essay in your honor at one point. I can't remember who, basically calling you one of the great living economists, despite your lack of a PhD.
Oh my gosh, who did that? I am not an economist. I mean, I'm an amateur and I follow it, and I try to be more like a synthesizer and conveyor to readership. That's really I've been a generalist and also, yeah, like this synthesizer for non-specialists.
You're great at that, but I think their point was just that you probably know more economics than a lot of professional economists. And
that's very nice. That's very nice to hear. I'm not being falsely modest when I say what I say.
Well,
this was a book of essays dating back maybe 20 years or so, maybe a little more. And so these were online articles. There are a lot of them because they're not very long. The book's not that thick, but if you look at the table of contents, it's like, my gosh, there's a lot of stuff here. That's because, there are 1,200 words, maybe a little less, maybe one or two went to 1,500, something like that. These are not long reads, and you can jump around, right? You can pick the topic by looking at the table of contents. It's not something you've got to read from, page one to the end. I'm not telling a unified story. Obviously, the unified story is the case for liberty. It's just over the years, I've tried to attack it from many different angles. So, don't look for some, within the theme of liberty, don't look for one unified theme. It's going to be on all kinds of things. Yeah, what social animals? That's a play on a title by a classical liberal, famous classical liberal of his day, William Graham Sumner, who wrote a book, or I think that was a book of essays too, called What Social Classes Owe to Each Other. And he was one of the founders of American sociology. He was a Yale University professor, but he was a libertarian. I mean, we'd call him that. They wouldn't use that word. He would have just said liberal probably back then. He lived like late 19th century into the 20th century. And he was one of the anti-imperialists. He was in the American Anti-Imperialist League. He wrote a very famous essay, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, called The Conquest of the United States by Spain.
Great essay.
It's like a really, I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's a very odd title. What do you mean, the conquest of the United States by Spain? Spain didn't conquer, except he said, well, in effect, by going out and defeating the Spanish Empire and conquering the Philippines, taking over the Philippines and, Cuba and becoming an Asian power, our values have now been replaced by Spanish imperial values. That's what he meant by that. We are now a world empire, which he was against. He was for small government, generally laissez-faire. And so I just picked up on his title because for a particular essay, which then I elevated to I like the title so much, I put it on the whole book. This is a difficult question. I think what we are social animals. And this is any libertarian, it's certainly a major thing in Austrian economics. We thrive through social cooperation. Mises was going to call human action. He was going to title that book Social Cooperation.
Yeah, I saw that. That's a new fact to me. That's very interesting.
And somebody did a computer count. I once speculated that it's probably social cooperation is probably the second most common phrase in that book, second to division of labor. And somebody ran it through one of those computer programs to count phrases and said I was right. I mean, it was just a guess, but it made sense. It made sense. It didn't show any great savviness on my part. He certainly does use division of labor an awful lot. But we thrive through social cooperation and the division of labor. And this goes back to Aristotle and the Greeks, who I've been influenced by over the years. I mean, not that I'm an expert or read very deeply. I'm also not, I have no PhD, so it goes without saying I have no PhD in philosophy. But I've read some Aristotle and Aristotelians, modern interpreters of. So I like that approach. And so what we owe to social animals, to other social animals, is really what we owe to ourselves, namely reason. We should live by reason. This is sort of a Greek view. And you see this in Rand, you see it in Rothbard. Reason is our means of survival, to use Rand's phrase. And therefore, we want to it's to our interest to deal with people by reason. And that means not to deal with them by force. That's how we individually will thrive. And if you want to look at it in egoistic terms, and put kind of in Rand's, because virtuous selfishness and all that, it's in my interest to live by reason and to want other people to live by reason, because through that I have all kinds of dealings, not just commercial dealings, trading goods for money, but the whole spectrum. of constructive relationships with people. And reason is the foundation of that, at least as I see it. And so we owe to others what we owe to ourselves. It's kind of indirect. We don't owe it directly to others, in my view. And I'm groping here because it's hard to make a really hard case. I mean, Aristotle points out several times that not every discipline has the same kind of proofs. In other words, proofs in mathematics, you're not going to find that kind of proof that you find in ethics. And he says this several times in his own book on ethics. It's a different sort of thing. It's a little hard to articulate, but we thrive by dealing with others on the basis of reason.
We were talking about, owing to others the same thing we owe to ourselves. And I think maybe in some sense that it's in our own interest to treat others, in accordance with reason, to deal with others through reason instead of through force or other means. And that can make it sound to some people like there's just this instrumental means ends reasoning. I should be reasonable with other people or treat other people nice because it's in my interest. And maybe that sounds...
It's not just that. And this brings up a distinction I know you wanted to ask about.
Yeah, that's where I was going.
Namely, the difference between instrumental means and constitutive means, which comes from the word, constitutive means. And I get this directly from the libertarian philosopher, Roderick Long at Auburn University.
That's where I first found the distinction.
Who is an interpreter of Aristotle, and I'm impressed with his work in ethics, certainly. And he's also written a little book called Reason and Value, demonstrating, at least to my satisfaction, that Rand was not Aristotelian enough. Ayn Rand was not Aristotelian enough in terms of both her theory of knowledge and also her ethics, which seems a little interesting. It might strike somebody as, how can that be? In fact, he goes on to point out where she thinks she's corrected Aristotle, that's where she's at her weakest. The book you can find on Amazon. It's not simple reading, but it's accessible to people who are interested. And I've read it a couple of times because I find it so interesting. He introduces this, and I've heard him do this in lectures. You can find them on YouTube. He didn't introduce. He brings up this distinction. I'm not saying he invented this, and he wouldn't say it, between an instrumental means and a constitutive means. So instrumental, the philosopher David Hume made the statement that reason is a slave to the passions. It can only be that, according to, and Mises would kind of agree with that. In other words, reason is good instrumentally to tell you how to get where you want to go, but it's not capable of telling you where you should go. Mises would say the same thing, and that comes out of David Hume, a very interesting philosopher in a lot of ways, and politically and economically good in some ways. In other words, when you say an instrumental means, it's a means to an end, but it's kind of like a bridge, right? From here to whatever the end is that I've picked out. But reason doesn't itself examine the end, because Hume and even Mises would say it can't do that. That's arbitrary, that's subjective. You can say that the means you've chosen won't get you there, but you can't say you shouldn't go there. Okay, that's an instrumental means. A constitutive means, it is a means, but it's not a bridge, an external bridge to the end. It's part of the end. So here's an example of the distinction that Roderick uses. If you want to play Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto, and you're playing it, and someone says, why did you hit that note right then? The proper answer would be, well, if I don't hit that note right then, I'm not playing Tchaikovsky's piano concerto. Because hitting that note is a means that's built into the end. On the other hand, if I say I have to go out and buy the sheet music before I can play it, that's not internal, right? Going out and getting the music. The way hitting these notes are at the right time is. So that gives you an idea of the distinction.
Because you could learn the music in another way, potentially.
External, yeah. But you can't play the Tchaikovsky's first concerto in another way, because otherwise then you'd be playing something else. It might sound a little like it, but it's not the same thing. So it's external versus internal. I think that's very interesting. So where Roderick wants to go with that is that living by reason is not just an external means to your self-interest. It's part and parcel. There's another phrase you can use as substitute for constitutive. It's part and parcel of achieving your interest, achieving your excellence as a human being, to put it in kind of Greek terms, right? The virtues aren't the way later philosophy and theology thought of them. It's aiming toward excellence as a human being, perfection, reason, and the other virtues, prudence, courage, those various things. So some of this is in Rand, and Roderick, of course, points this out. It's just that she's not totally consistent because she'll say man's life qua man, right, as man. It's not just survival as any old kind of being. It's the survival as a human being, which means as a reasoning being, reason using, language using being. So I hope that's clear.
Yeah. David Friedman, I think, has pointed out that about Rand, that she sometimes equivocates between saying that the ultimate goal of human life is survival on the one hand versus survival as man qua man. And those two things
Survival
might give you different answers.
Yes. There's a debate called survival v flourishing.
Exactly.
Versus flourishing. And Roderick's arguing that, Rand is inconsistent. There are some places where she's clearly talking about flourishing, that qua man is that. But there are other times where it's just, no, you just want to survive as long as you can. Doesn't matter how. It does kind of sound that way. So he's trying to show, she's not quite right. She doesn't have it all right. And Aristotle would have helped her out more if she had paid a little more attention to him. She thought she made improvements over Aristotle, and he doesn't think that. Anyway, that's roughly my orientation. I'm not a professional philosopher. It can get very fuzzy. I find economics much more solid than philosophy.
Yes. But whenever I've read Roderick on that, and I have, and he was a big source of my understanding, I think, his type of contemporary neo-Aristotelian ethical thought, made it more concrete for me than anyone else had. I find it really persuasive. But it's not like a math proof. It sounds like very plausible that I couldn't describe to you perfectly, what it would mean to live the best kind of life. But if you name virtues and, living rationally and being honest and the types of virtues that Greek thinkers think about and modern philosophers as well, that those are not just a means to living a good life, but they're part of living a good life and they're maybe quite central to it. That sounds very plausible to me. Yeah. But
I agree with what you're saying. And I was going to bring up Adam Smith, not because of his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is kind of a different approach, but long after the Greeks. See, for the Greeks, living ethically and achieving the good life, happiness, eudaimonia, whatever term you want to use, were one and the same things. There was no diversion. But later, and Adam Smith laments this in The Wealth of Nations, believe it or not, he laments that ethics got separated from happiness. And you can see this happened under theology and even more secularized versions of philosophy that still kind of kept a lot of the vestiges of religion, where their morality was pleasing the god or gods. But for the Greeks and for the modern day Aristotelians, and Rand would agree with this too, of course, because she's certainly in that tradition, ethics and achieving your happiness are the same project. And you can see how in modern thinking, those two things have been separated. People think of ethics or morality as like, are you nice to other people if they're not religious? But some religious people may say, are you carrying out God's commandments, or are you, acting according to the will of God? And Kant separated it. I mean, again, I'm no expert in Kant either, but I've done a little reading about him. And you see, because he has this idea of duty, whether or not you benefit from it, there are certain things you ought to be doing. And so you see how it's separate. It's very different from the Greek approach. And that's been carried on by a lot of libertarians, not all, certainly not David Friedman, because David Friedman is really skeptical about moral philosophy. He's much more in the camp of Michael Humer, and the intuition. Yeah, which says a lot of interesting things. It's a very tempting view. I still have some reservations about it. Anyway, that's...
Yeah, I think in reading and talking to both of them about that issue, I think the view that Mike has is not that there isn't a deeper justification, maybe along these lines, for moral truths, but just that he has less confidence in his ability to say exactly what it is, and that the intuition method is maybe a more persuasive and solid way of getting at some fairly simple truths. It doesn't give you at the details. And David Friedman, meanwhile, is more skeptical than he is that they might even be true. I've heard him say that he thinks it's intellectually plausible that moral nihilism is the correct answer, but he cannot for the life of him get himself to actually believe that, even though it seems like it could be a correct answer.
Yeah, and he doesn't think Humer quite delivers on his promise to prove intuitionism is the sounder approach. I mean, he's very interested in it, but he doesn't think humor has nailed it. We're getting into esoteric here where I am not expertise. And I don't spend, every day thinking about the fine points of moral philosophy. In fact, sometimes I get fed up with it, thinking nobody can make their case.
Yeah.
Let's go to economics and flourishing through social cooperation, that was Henry Hazlitt's approach. It was Mises's approach. That seems a little bit harder in the sense of you can make a solid case. But I don't want to give up moral philosophy either.
It's very interesting. Yeah, let's jump into some more specific questions in some of your essays. So you've got a great phrase in one of your essays where you say that, talking about economics and economic competition, that competition is the complement, not the opposite of cooperation. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm surely not the first to say this, but maybe I said it, saying it that way will make a breakthrough for some people. I mean, you hear certainly people who regard themselves as of the left. And by the way, I don't like these words, left, right, conservative, progressive, but we don't have other language yet, so I guess I'll stick with it for now. But, they oppose competition and cooperation. Those are loggerheads. I mean, can't we cooperate? It sounds so nice. We're sitting around the fire, the open fire or the campfire singing songs. And can we cooperate? What do we need to have this? And I love the phrase, dog eat dog competition. But it occurred to me, and I have to attribute it to all the good economists I've read. It occurred to me one day, if you walk into a mall, you need shoes. Okay, so you walk into, do people walk into malls, or am I dating myself here?
Yes, we do.
A shopping mall. I don't know how many are left these days. And there's 2 shoe stores, and I need shoes. So how do we look at this? What's the relationship between the 2 shoe stores? Well, they're competing with each other. They have roughly the same kind of shoes. They're not niche, markets. But I need shoes. So what are they competing to do? They're competing to see who's going to be the one to cooperate with me. They're vying with each other, to cooperate with me. I get to make the choice, and they try to make the best offer, high quality, variety, price, whatever it is, bright lights in the shop, attractive shop. It seems to me that's the case right there. And I never heard anybody challenge it. Their competition is about who's going to cooperate at a given time in a given place with a given consumer or a group of consumers by offering the most attractive package. It may not just be price, may not just be quality. It's a whole package. So that's what I mean by it. I mean, feel free to follow up on that, but it seems to be it shouldn't be, for a left winger, it shouldn't be a difficult point to understand. It's a voluntary system, right? I choose which shoe store, and of course, they're obviously eager to sell so that we know they're volunteering. What's the alternative? Compulsory cooperation? That doesn't sound very good. Mandatory cooperation with some anointed vendor, by the state? Is that what the pro-cooperationists want? Under communism, you had to cooperate with the one seller, ultimately with the state. That doesn't sound very good to me. You want to call that cooperation? Go ahead, but it doesn't sound very good. Doesn't sound very good to me. You want competition and cooperation rolled up into one, and that's what the free market gives you.
And competition, by the way, that's not aggressive or violent. I mean, this is the best case scenario. And it's not even competition. I forget who said, the trouble with competitions is someone loses them, as a little quip against the free market. But that's got to be some equivocation about different senses of how you can lose a competition. I mean, losing a war is different from losing a race, but both of those are different from losing in the context of a market, because one, it's not a zero-sum game. So when you play a game, it's an artificial construct, and it's usually zero-sum, so that one person's victory is another person's loss. But that's not true in a market. And also, just because you are not as successful as your neighbor doesn't mean you can't be successful at all. And it doesn't mean you can't be successful in the future at something else. And put your abilities and your property to better use. You may find that you're not the best coffee salesman or something, but that may eventually lead you to something that you are better at.
My favorite line in Human Action, it's kind of on point, but it's about shoes. So it's relevant for that. It's on page 700 something. I can look it up. I have a note of it somewhere. I can look it up very quickly. But he makes the point. It's not exactly on this point, but it's close enough. He says the fact that Everybody or lots of people want shoes just like I do. It makes it easier for me to get shoes, not harder.
Yeah.
That's counterintuitive for a lot of people. We're not competing as consumers. Generally, we don't compete as consumers. We compete as producers. Animals compete as consumers, don't they?
100,000 years ago, we did too.
That's right. We did too. But look how trade has civilized us. We compete as producers, not consumers. Now, it gets to your point. When somebody, the idea that somebody's going to lose. Well, and like you say, in a lot of senses, you can lose the sale. That's kind of maybe at the bottom of the ladder. You could go bankrupt, let's say. Maybe you're losing too many sales. That other store's too good, that shoe store. So you can go bankrupt. And maybe you have to go to work for the other store. But you don't get sent to the gulag. You don't get sent, marched out to the guillotine or exiled on Devil's Island or whatever, or stoned. You don't lose in that sense. So the worst that can happen is you may end up in debt and bankrupt, and yeah, you got to regroup. That's not a pleasant thing. But the point is, you always have to say, what's the alternative, right? I used to tell students at lectures I did at the Foundation for Economic Education, I would remind them of a 1970s hit song that had the title, and it was the first line in the song, I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. Libertarianism and free market economics doesn't say all problems go away. We still live in a world of scarcity, and that's a big part of the explanation for why lots of problems result. The point is, among the possible alternatives for addressing problems, what beats the marketplace? And that's where I think we win hands down. We know that authoritarianism, socialism, national socialism, or international socialism, they're just two competing brands of the same rotten product, can't do it. Aside from all the bad stuff, they also can't produce the goods. The socialists used to promise they could outproduce the free market or capitalism. Not my favorite word, capitalism. But then when we had demonstrations all over the world that wasn't the case, they had to turn to the problem with capitalism is it produces too much. They used to say it doesn't produce enough. Now the problem is it produces too much.
I think a lot of contemporary younger people who are sympathetic to socialism just don't know that history. They don't know that it used to be the real debate was no, socialism is more productive than capitalism. It's going to give us, they were making the economic case. Hey everybody, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a minute to thank everybody so much for listening to my show. This has really been a dream come true for me, to be able to speak with scholars that I admire and read books every week that I'm always excited to read. This is still a small show, still a new show, still growing, and I appreciate everyone listening so much. If you want to help me grow my show, the simplest thing you can do is to write a review, just a short review, a sentence or two, on Apple Podcasts, or just recommend it to a friend. So I'm just reaching out to you to beg you humbly on my knees to please do that. I'm going to try not to bug you too much about it, but here I am bugging you. Anyway, back to the show. You've got another essay in this book called Monopoly and Aggression, with another line that I just absolutely love. So you're talking about how, one, the concept of monopoly is not as straightforward as some people think it is. And just because you're the only producer in general or in a specific area of something doesn't make you a monopoly, or in the relevant sense, maybe it doesn't make you a monopoly. It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want and charge whatever you want without taking your rival producers into account. But then this is the line I love. You say, you don't even know who your rivals are until they arise in response to your consumer alienating actions. So what do you mean by that? You don't know who your rivals are. Surely it's the other coffee shop next door.
And that's because it's hard to define the market. So when you say, oh, you're a monopoly, you're the sole seller, you have all this power in the market. The question is what market? Back in the 80s, the antitrust division of the Justice Department, or maybe it was the FTC, brought an action against the big makers of ready-to-eat cereals, saying they were a monopoly because there was more than one company. So we use monopoly kind of loosely here. Monopoly suggests one, right? Mono. But anyway, and the free market critics of antitrust on that case in particular said it's arbitrary to say that the ready-to-eat cereal companies only compete against each other makers of ready-to-eat cereals. That's not the only thing people eat for breakfast. And if they find that ready-to-eat cereals are too expensive, more expensive than they personally want to spend. Again, this is subjective. And by subjective, I mean personal, right? Your own personal circumstances. You say, I don't want to spend that much money on whatever Post, Kellogg's, and the top three companies, I guess. People find substitutes. And even today, people eat oatmeal, not ready to eat, but oatmeal. And there's even instant oatmeal and microwave oatmeal. Companies came forward and made it closer to ready to eat. There's bacon and eggs, there's yogurt. What's the market? So you could say, oh, look how concentrated Kellogg's is. If I only look at cornflakes, my gosh, they have 99% of the sales in cornflakes. Well, cornflakes aren't the only thing to eat. So don't you think there's market pressure on Kellogg's? Even if there's no one else making cornflakes, and of course there are other people making cornflakes, but if there weren't, you could still say that they can't just charge anything they want. That's what people seem to fear, right? Anti-market people seem to fear. Oh, they'll charge $100 a box. Yeah, and what's the revenue going to be? What's the profit going to be? They're not going to make any sales. So there's always competition in the real sense, existing competition, but no observer, economist or otherwise, can say only these firms are competing with that firm, but not these firms over here. That's arbitrary for the observer to say that. We have to see what consumers do. And so there's either real firms competing or there's always potential competition. One of the great theorists on this is Dominic Armentano, D.T. Armentano, who many years ago, and he's updated it and written it various ways, wrote a book called Antitrust, Competition and Antitrust, or something like that. You can find it at the Independent Institute. But there's no need for it, and it's destructive. So it's just very bad. And one thing he points out is if you don't want competition, no, every company would like to be a monopoly, right? A monopolist. And on the other hand, as a consumer, wouldn't it be very nice to say, I hope every company tries really hard to become a monopoly, not by turning to government. That's where the coercion comes in. Market methods, because that means I'm going to get really well served, right? If everybody's trying to be the monopolist, doesn't that mean they're going to have to be pretty darn good in anticipating my wants or even getting out ahead of me and showing me things I now want that I didn't even dream of? I didn't dream of having an iPhone or a smartphone, an Android phone, back before those things ever made it in the market. There were a few visionaries, but I wasn't saying, boy, I wish I had a computer in my pocket that could do all kinds of things. So, number one, as a consumer, I want everybody trying to be a monopoly. That's good, because I and all my fellow consumers are going to get great deals. But the flip side is, and this is from Armentano, if you don't want competition for your company or your store, then make sure you have very low profits, which would mean also very low prices. Just make sure you do that, because if you have abnormally high prices and high profits, that's like getting on the roof with a microphone saying, hey, venture capitalists, people with capital to invest in new areas, you want to come into this industry because look how well I'm doing. It's like inviting competition to have abnormally high profits. That's what a venture capitalist looks for, abnormally high profits. He's not going to go to where profits are pretty much run of the mill. You can get it anywhere. So if a monopoly suddenly, I call it a monopoly, think of quotes around it. If they suddenly think, hey, I'm alone in the market, like Amazon, I can now charge whatever I want, that's going to be an invitation to new competition. And there are always people with money looking for areas to invest where they're going to get extraordinary return, at least in the short run. So we don't need to worry about it. Lena Khan should go home. We had a high-priced job as a lawyer. Or, as Donald Boudreaux pointed out, if she has such great ideas about how the economy should look, why doesn't she take some money, get some venture capitalists to back her, and go in and start a company? She has these great ideas about how inefficient the current system is in high tech and other places. Let her go in and compete. Instead, she wants to regulate. So they ought to close down the FTC, evil thing that goes back to the Woodrow Wilson years, and also the Justice Department's antitrust division. They hurt us. And they tend to protect other competitors, not consumers.
Yeah, that was an insight that was really novel to me. I remember when I first heard it years ago, and I just thought was super illuminating that you can't just tell who the competition is. So saying something's a monopoly presumes that you can look out at the field and say, this is your competitor, this is your competitor, this is your competitor, but you can't. You don't know who's sitting at home nursing an idea to start a company that could compete with you if you step out of line and become less competitive. And as you just said, there's no better way to become less competitive than charging exorbitant prices when you don't need
consumers react. Consumers are agents, right? They're rational human beings. They tend to want to spend as little as possible, other things equal, light of quality and stuff like that. And so they're going to adjust. If they see a price that looks out of line to them, they will adjust. What do you expect them to do? We all do it every day in life. So
Yeah.
why do we think it only we do it? No one else does it. It's like the same people that say, "Oh, we don't like advertising." There used to be a tax on advertising, right? You say, "Oh, are you fooled by you go out and buy everything that you see advertised on TV?" Oh, not. I don't mean me. Everybody else does. They're
those
foolish.
other rubes.
Oh, I'm not. I don't mean me.
One of the justifications for government action is this concept of market failure. And you've got a great essay called The Myth of Market Failure. So, in what sense do you think market failure is a myth?
And, full disclosure, I was piggybacking on a great article by David Friedman, who I'm a big fan of. You can find it at his site, daviddfriedman.com. And I always have learned a lot from him. I've been aware of his work, since I was a new libertarian. And he's not a whole lot older than I am, but he's a very smart guy, which you'd expect of Milton Friedman's son. So I called it the myth of market failure, but not to say that the problem that usually gets that title doesn't exist. I was being a little bit cheeky there. What I wanted to say is that it maligns the market to call it market failure. It's kind of a feature of life, including in spheres outside the market. And as Friedman points out, it riddles the government. I mean, it's a problem that plagues the government. In fact, he argues that this failure that he's talking about, and he often does call it market failure because that's the term in economics. I object to it, but who am I? I'm not in the profession. I just don't think it's not specifically market. So why do you want to stigmatize the market as having this failure? But it's kind of a problem that comes about when it's sometimes called the problem of group action or group rationality. So Friedman gives some examples, but in general, it's when each individual makes what looks like a rational decision from his point of view for him, and everybody's doing that because that is kind of the obvious rational decision. The outcome from the whole group making that decision individually, the group outcome is something no individual likes. So there was an example of broadcast radio when it first started, over the air radio many years ago, right? Whenever this was, 1920s or something. The problem was if you produced a program and then put it out over the airwaves, anybody could buy a radio and then have to pay for the show. Once you had your radio, which wasn't coming from the producer of the show, they could for free get the show, get your program. Now you could say, please send in money, so we can keep the show going. It's for your interest, people. Now everybody, the millions of people or thousands of people who are listening to this, say, well, I could send some money in, but hey, if I'm the only one that doesn't send money in, I still get a free show. Other people are sending money in. But if everybody thinks that, there's no show. So we're unhappy. We want the show, but each of us calculates, hey, I'll hold back. It's called kind of like the holdout type, right? What do I need to pay for? They're all paying. Therefore, I'll be a free rider, right? I'll be the free rider. However, everybody thinks that, or enough people think it, that no show, the production company closes down, and then we say, oh, I'm sad. I wanted a show. In other words, my free rider strategy didn't work very well because everyone else engaged in the free rider strategy. So that would be regarded as a market failure, one form of market failure. Now, it's very interesting that that problem got solved, didn't it? Some bright person said, and that person, we should know that person's name. That person should be famous. Okay, because we're going back early in the 20th century. Said, I got an idea. Why don't we charge people to advertise their soap on our program? Hence the word soap opera. Why don't we get soap companies, not to be soap companies, they'll pay us for a minute or so to pitch their program. And then they recoup that in the price of their product, if they're lucky, successful, if people like their thing. And then we don't have to rely on the listener to send money in. He can be a free rider, except if he buys the product, then he's not actually a free rider, right? Because he's paying the soap company. And that, guess what? That worked. We've had commercial radio, had commercial TV. Of course, we're out of that age now. I'm showing my age again because now it's internet and streaming and all that stuff. Oh, well, there's still ads. There's still ads. Now, would a bureaucrat have thought of that? The point is, there was a profit motive to come up with a solution to what looked like a deadly problem. Well, we can't have broadcast radio because you can't exclude non-payers. It's also called public good, right? If you can't exclude non-payers, who's going to produce it? The old story was the lighthouse. There can't be for-profit lighthouses. You can't turn the light off for someone not paying. I mean, how can you do that? The ships, the boats are out there. You can't say, turn it off for that guy. He didn't pay us. I mean, you're not going to even know. However, Ronald Coase did research on this and said, in fact, there were for-profit lighthouses. And even when the British government took over the lighthouses, they didn't turn to taxation. The idea was we got to tax, right? The people that wanted to defend the government to fix the market failure would say taxation is the solution. Since you can't rely on voluntary payment by the free riders, we can throw them in jail if they don't pay. There's the solution. That's how government was going to fix the market. Except Coase showed that even when the British government took over the lighthouses, they didn't go to a taxation system. They still relied for a while on a fee system, fee from the ships that came into port, and they could calculate what lights you used. And that's a famous story in the economic history. So Friedman points out that this failure, which he's calling market failure, is much more pervasive in the government than it is in the marketplace. In the marketplace, at least you have profit-seeking entrepreneurs who have a very strong incentive to solve the problems, like the guy that said, let's sell time to the soap companies, because he personally profited. Even the leftists would agree the profit motive is very powerful, as an inducement to solving problems. But what about in government? And Friedman is somewhat here riding on the public choice school, James Buchanan, right, and Tulloch, because what they said was, okay, maybe there's market failure problems, but what makes you think there aren't government failures and that they're not worse than the market failure? You can't just say, oh, market fails, government should stand in. What if the government's worse? They used to compare it to a singing contest, before a king. He would have this annual singing contest, and the first person would sing, and he'd say, you stink. The person who hasn't even sung yet, you win. That's the pro-government type solution to this. So Friedman points out the public choice or public good problems are pervasive in government. They're only kind of rare in markets. And here's the difference. In a marketplace, you choose what you want and you pay for it. There's an old Spanish proverb about take what you want and pay for it. That's how it works in the marketplace. If I go to my local supermarket and want to buy a dozen eggs, I choose a dozen eggs and put it in my cart. I see the price and I pay the price, and I'm going to get the benefit of the eggs. Maybe my family too, of course. But I mean, generally, I eat the eggs. In politics, if you ran supermarkets like politics, you'd go and you'd vote for one of a couple, two or more pre-arranged or pre-selected trolley grocery carts. You'd vote for the one that you had more things that you wanted and the fewest things that you don't want. And then you'd go home and wait for the voting returns and see what the majority picked. And then you'd go pick up that package of goods. That's if we ran grocery stores like democracy.
And you probably wouldn't pay that much attention to what was in the cart because you're not really a big part of the decision.
You're really no part. Not only can't you customize it, you only get one vote out of how many votes. So in politics, you get one vote, which is inconsequential. I think Tulloch calculated that you have a better chance of getting hit by lightning on the way to the polls or hit by a car or something, dying in a car crash on the way to the polls. So one vote means almost nothing. If you live in a tiny town, once in a while you hear a story. There was a tie for mayor or dog catcher in some little tiny town. It makes the news because it's so unusual. But most towns are not that small. I mean, certainly in the presidential election, congressional election, Senate, et cetera, governor, you vote. If you stay home, nothing's going to change. No election in my lifetime would have been different if I had done something different. And I don't vote these days. I mean, I voted a couple times earlier. So you have no incentive to do any kind of study. People study a lot more before they buy a new toaster or microwave than they do before a presidential election. And it's perfectly rational. Brian Kaplan has written a lot about this too, and many others. Ilya Soman and many people have done this. Why do people spend more time researching a toaster than researching the presidential election? Because when they make a decision on the toaster, that's the toaster they get. And they know the price. They're going to pay the price out of their pocket. It doesn't apply in elections. So you have no incentive to study anything. So you just vote your biases, as Brian would say. You vote your biases. You're rationally irrational. You stick with whatever biases you already have, because there's no point in seeing if you're wrong or some other candidate can talk me out of my views. There's no point to it. And then also, whoever gets in, assuming there are benefits from whoever gets in, unlikely in politics, but assuming there are benefits, since you're one of many voters, especially if it's president in the whole country, you're going to get a tiny fraction of any benefits. And if there's a big expense from it, you're only going to pay a tiny fraction of the cost. Unlike when I go buy eggs, I not only get eggs, I also know, okay, I have to pay the $3 or $4. I don't just pay a fraction of the $3 or $4 and maybe or maybe not get the eggs. So that's a whole different ball game. It induces irresponsibility because your vote doesn't mean anything, and you're not going to either get much of the benefit or much of the burden. And so there's no solution to that. I mean, an example is if I say to a group of my friends, I'm going to go to Washington and lobby for lower taxes. So it's a good cause, right? All my friends want lower taxes. So I say, okay, it takes money to travel to Washington and lobby. So I want everybody to kick in and I pass around, the hat. You're all going to benefit if I get it. And again, it's the free rider problem. A lot of people are going to say, well, I'll think about it, because everybody will say, hey, I don't really need to put money in. If he gets it, I'm going to get the benefit, whether I give him any money, travel money or not. But of course, if nobody puts money in, then I don't go. And so we don't get everybody sad because, hey, we didn't get the tax. We didn't get the tax cut. Well, it's because I didn't go to Washington. Why? Because you didn't put any money in. And everybody agreed. So I hope the distinction is clear. This failure or things very similar to it occur both in the free market, but rarely. And there's entrepreneurial incentive to find solutions. And it happens in the political realm, but much more frequently. And there's no profit incentive. A bureaucrat doesn't have any incentive. He may get a bigger budget if he is perceived to be a failure. If his agency is a failure,
that's the norm in politics.
Because we didn't have enough money. He doesn't personally benefit like getting entrepreneurial profits, right? If he comes up with some solution that nobody had thought of, it because it's a different realm. So I just really wanted to report Friedman's analysis of that because I thought he's put it so well. And I said to my readers, go read. Reading my article is not a substitute for reading his article. Go read it because he pointed it out so brilliantly.
It's also a talk I know he gives a lot. And I think the tagline is something like that market failure is a great argument against laissez-faire, but it's a better argument against government.
Exactly right. And you can find that on YouTube. Yeah, if you don't want to read it, just search on David Friedman and look for words related to market failure and stuff like that. You'll find it. He's given it a lot.
It's a great point. And, you point out that the fact that that's the term market failure is kind of a coup. There's nothing unique about markets to it. You propose the term group rationality problem. Is that right?
I think David also calls it that, group rationality.
I think collective action problem is the most common term I've seen.
Collective action. Yes.
That is, I think, a plausible alternative. And it just seems more accurate. I mean, it's a problem you're identifying that happens when individual rationality doesn't lead to group rationality.
Right.
For a variety of reasons.
Individual rationality leads to a situation where every individual is unhappy with the outcome. That's probably a pretty good way to describe it too. And it gets into game theory with prisoners' dilemmas. People can look that up if they want, read up on prisoners' dilemmas, where you have two people are brought into the police station charged with a crime, and they're held separately. They can't talk to each other. They can't coordinate, which means it's not the market. If they can't coordinate, then you're not talking about the market. But you tell them separately, the cops tell them separately, they give them all the alternatives, right? If they both remain quiet, then they get a really minor sentence, and that's fine. But if one fingers the other guy and the other guy stays silent, the silent guy's going to get it really bad, and the guy who speaks is going to get it even better, maybe zero penalty. And then I think there's two other alternatives. The upshot is it won't be to their interest to do what gets them zero, because if they keep quiet and the other guy fingers them, they're in trouble. And the other guy's thinking that too. So they both keep quiet.
I always have a hard time describing. They both rat out the other one. They'd be both better off if they both stayed quiet, but they have the incentive to both rat each other out.
And they can't communicate. That's really the problem, which takes it out of like I said, takes it out of the market, because the market's about communication, prices, and also conversations. I mean, it's not just prices that communicate, but it's all about communication. So I think sometimes maybe game theory is taken too far in applying it to markets. Although on the other hand, the antitrust people don't want two companies talking about prices, but it may actually be the rational thing to do that's even good for consumers and avoid wasteful investments by the companies. I think Peter Boettke's written about this, that even what seems like benign, don't let competitors talk about price, may actually be bad for consumers.
I'll have to check out that. I haven't read much Pete Boettke. I've heard him talk a little bit, and it seems like someone I'd be interested in reading.
Yeah, another person I've known for a very long time. And he was still a graduate student at George Mason, and now he's like a really big guy at George Mason.
Yeah.
He runs a lot of programs. Yeah.
So you've been involved with brilliant people like Peter and Brian and all of your life, and so many libertarians are so persuasive in their writings.
And many that passed the scene, sadly. I mean, I knew Murray Rothbard.
Yeah.
I talked to him on many occasions. I visited his apartment, the famous apartment in New York, where he said the whole movement once could fit. And he'd been to my house once. So and I knew Ralph Rako, a great libertarian historian. He was a dear friend. I was very pleased to get to meet a lot of these people. I did not meet Mises. I once saw Mises in person, but I didn't actually meet him or sit and talk with him.
Were you at Rothbard's apartment when the Circle Bastiat was going on?
No, that was a little early for me. Yeah, that group was older than me. But that was Rako, that was Leonard Liggio. I worked with Leonard Liggio for many years, Institute for Humane Studies. He was part of that. Robert Hessen, who I met only once, recently died. He was part of that. George Reisman. I never met Reisman. So yeah, they were an earlier generation, like one generation ahead of me.
These guys are all so persuasive in their speeches and writings and talks, debates. Who do you think of the people you've met were the most persuasive just on a personal level, one-to-one conversations, living room chats, things like that? Who sticks out?
Yeah, it gives me a chance to mention another name. I think Walter Grinder, who was an old friend of Rothbard's. I think he wasn't in New York, so he wasn't in the Circle Bastiat, but he was a major figure at the Institute for Humane Studies for many years, and I worked there 5 years, so I got to know him well, and I had met him already before that. He was a very soft-spoken and persuasive person. I've heard him lecture on economics, which was his main interest, at least earlier in his career, but he was interested in the whole interdisciplinary study of liberty. He could be persuasive. Who else was persuasive? I mean, I've heard lecture many times, but also just in conversation. Rothbard could be persuasive, both up on the stage, but also privately. There are a lot of people who've been very good. I could kind of think up some other names, but Carl Hess could be very persuasive. He would give very kind of very laid back, but very good talks at libertarian conventions. He could be very persuasive.
Yeah. So you've had so many institutional affiliations in your long and storied libertarian career. Currently, you are the executive editor at the Libertarian Institute. Can you say something about that organization?
Yeah, that's true. Somebody might look at my record and say, well, you had a hard time holding a job. I started out as a newspaper reporter, so it took me a while to actually become a professional movement person. And jobs tended to last like 5 years for me, with the exception being the Freeman, where 15 years I was the editor in the beginning of the late 90s. But I've worked for Cato, I worked for Institute for Humane Studies, I worked for some groups that don't exist anymore, Council for a Competitive Economy. But about 8 years ago, Scott Horton, I shouldn't start just with the last name, I hadn't mentioned him yet. Scott Horton got on the phone to me and Will Grigg, the late Will Grigg. He was a libertarian and concentrated a lot on police abuse, police brutality. I mean, he really made his name on that, wrote lots of articles and essays. And I was in California at the time. I was living out there briefly. And I remember getting calls from him saying, we need to do something. We need to start something up. I was kind of between jobs, just making a little money, freelancing, writing for the Future of Freedom Foundation. My fee days were already behind me. The Freeman days were behind me. So I said to Scott, yeah, well, count me in, let me know. And that was 8 years ago. And I don't know how long after it took to actually set up the organization, but Scott did the bulk of the work. I will say that, as far as organizing and getting the various legal documents to incorporate and all this stuff, tax, 501c3, all that stuff. He did the bulk of the work. I was just writing weekly for the most part. Will Grigg unfortunately died. Oh, I don't know how many years ago now. 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So I write a weekly article and occasional blog posts for the Libertarian Institute, but I am not involved in the day-to-day stuff. That's Scott, and Scott has recruited a whole host of younger writers who are really good, kind of hot properties. And the website, which is libertarianinstitute.org, every day has both original articles and, in a lot of cases, reposted articles on a whole host of issues. There is an emphasis on foreign policy, but I don't want to overstate that. I lately have been writing mostly about domestic, but there's still lots of pro market, pro civil liberties, as well as stuff against the surveillance state, the warfare state. Scott, of course, has great credentials. He's been doing his Scott Horton show for years and has, I don't know how many thousand interviews with the top names in mostly foreign policy analysis. Sometimes he'll get into other things, like he has an interest in the Oklahoma City bombing many years ago. He keeps up with that and gets amazing guests to talk about it who have special information, who have spent their lives researching. That's a show worth looking up. And of course, Scott is also involved in antiwar.com, that great website that's been around a long time, which is the best stuff. I think mostly reposts of the best stuff on non-interventionism, against war, against U.S. empire, against surveillance, that related stuff does not get into domestic economic stuff. So he's the guy. We put out, so not only have this daily crop of articles and new people coming on all the time. I don't know how many books now the Libertarian Institute has put out, but two of them are Scott's own books on Afghanistan, Fool's Errand, and then the whole war on terror.
Enough already.
Enough already. And my last two books we've already talked about, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other and Coming to Palestine, which is again a collection of articles going back over 30 years of writing about that subject, which is a whole other subject we can talk about sometime. But also a couple of books now on COVID, like Tom Woods' book on COVID, and then Laurie Calhoun's book on COVID, about what a mess that was, what a disaster, and China, and lots of subjects with more in the pipeline. I mean, Scott's working on a book regarding Russia and Ukraine. I believe
Provoked, right?
Provoked, yes. That title is already out there, right? So you can see. I think it's really a selection of things that you're not going to find other places. There are lots of great sites and doing lots of great things in the general libertarian category. But I really think Libertarian Institute has, and largely thanks to Scott, has carved out this big niche.
Yeah,
that is, I think, very impressive. I mean, I can't take credit for it. If my name attracted people, that's great. But he did the work.
I'm a huge fan of Scott, so I just wanted to make sure that got plugged, and yours as well, obviously. I usually like to ask people to recommend something that'll complement their own work, and I was wondering, with your history in the movement, if you could recommend a work, maybe an older work, and maybe something newer that would complement, if not this collection in particular, then your interests in general.
You put me a notice about that, so I gave it some thought. I didn't want to leave it to spur of the moment come up with something. Well, lately I've been reading Rothbard's An Austrian Perspective on the History of Economic Thought, which came out in the 90s. It was a 2-volume, but you can find it online, PDF, a combined volume, and also a ebook free for download. You can read it online, either computer or Kindle, or you can buy it. And it's really quite sweeping. Unfortunately, Rothbard died before he got to do, I guess, a third volume, which would have been from Austrian economists on.
This is his final project before he passed, right?
I think that's right. And it's quite amazing that a guy could have time, given all else he was doing. When I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, he's citing all kinds of works and quoting, and he could do something I certainly was not cut out to do, which was read a whole lot of stuff and absorb it and integrate it into other stuff he already knew. And they used to say, if you looked at the books in his apartment, he had margin notes through every book, some of them detailed. I mean, some people can do that and some people can't, because he's doing other things too. He's teaching, and he's got a social life, and married and going out with people. And I don't know how you do that. That's a great book. I'm going through the section now on Marx, and it's fun, entertaining, but also extremely informative. You'll learn things about Marx you may not know unless you already delve into Marx. Marx was a mess. To sum it up, Marx was a mess, a real mess. I also went back and read his section on Say's law of markets, about supply is demand. And that's really interesting, because that's what Keynes overthrew in terms of public opinion and professional opinion. There used to be this idea that recessions weren't the result of insufficient demand. It was because there was some problem on the supply side. The supply siders, a couple of decades ago, were trying to revive interest in save. The emphasis needs to be on production, not on consumption. Anybody can consume, but if people aren't producing things, consuming, you can't consume, right? Production precedes consumption. So that's an older book that I would recommend. And a later book, and I haven't read too many real recent books, but I really enjoyed Brian Kaplan's first graphic nonfiction novel, which I know sounds like a contradiction in terms, graphic non-novel, Open Borders, and it's very good. And he is a master of that form. And his follow-up, which I haven't read yet, but I plan to very soon, Build, Baby, Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Restrictions. Open Borders is, there's Build, Baby, Build. The subtitle of Open Borders is The Science and Ethics of Immigration Restriction. And he's brilliant at, working with an artist. So far has found two great artists. I'm not in the world of graphic novels. He did spend time in the world of graphic novels, and so he knows a lot about that. This is my first experience. I used to read comic books as a kid, but as far as graphic novels that are, kind of thick, he's brilliant because I think you can give that to an opponent of open borders and free immigration and say, just take it seriously, read the book and see what you think. And it's got the pictures, but they're all very useful pictures. It's not trivial stuff. And I think a person would come away saying, okay, this guy's really got an argument. Maybe I'm not yet convinced, but man, this guy makes a serious argument. And I'm sure he does the same thing on housing. I've seen him speak about the housing regulations. You can find him on YouTube. In both cases, he gives interviews on these topics. So that's one of the latest books I've read is Open Borders. I agree with both of the works I named, or I guess I named three, and they're worth checking out.
Great recommendation. And yeah, I was a big fan of Open Borders, and I'll plug that I spoke with Brian about Build Baby Build recently, so you can check out that episode if you're interested, and certainly check out the book. Yeah, it's every bit as good as Open Borders, and I'm just a huge fan of Brian. Do you have any upcoming projects you're working on right now?
I don't have any big projects. I write every week. I try to make it interesting. I try to find some fresh angle. These are not great times. I have to be frank, for libertarians or advocates of free markets. Obviously, except for Chase Oliver, nobody's talking about it. That was not necessarily a plug for the Libertarian Party. I haven't been involved in the Libertarian Party since 1983. I was national vice chairman from 81 to 83. That's a long time ago. That's a very long time ago. I haven't been involved in the party, whatever. But I think we're in a very bleak time. We're not on the menu. Nobody wants to hear about us. Even our non-libertarian allies on war, being anti-war, anti-surveillance, or anti-free speech, our allies in opposing those things, they think we're nuts when we talk about free markets. And so I don't know if there's a tendency not to talk so much about them because we don't want to alienate our allies on war, surveillance, and free speech, and other similar things. And so therefore, let's not play up our differences. I mean, after all, we got to work on these issues. Let's not play up our differences. But I think there's something being lost there. Nobody is interested in, I saw the debate, well, it was last night, but I saw it this morning, Trump and Harris. I mean, you want to go to the bathroom and, barf. This is terrible. I mean, we don't even have like a Reagan who at least rhetorically paid homage to free markets. Nothing whatever. It's social engineering all the way down. Someone along the lines must have said, we're all social engineers now. Just the way once somebody said, I think it was actually Friedman once said, we're all Keynesians now. Everybody's a social engineer except for libertarians and maybe a few other people who don't want to use that word, classical liberals, free market advocates. I mean, listen to what Trump and Harris are saying. It's all social engineering from the top for the most part. Maybe, they may make a little allowances here and there, but it's government at some level all the way. Nobody talks really about liberty. I know the Democrats had one night of their convention where they talked about freedom, but it didn't mean anything. It was just a slogan. So it's a bleak time. So I forget the question that I thought I was answering.
upcoming projects.
No big projects. Just I'm trying to find a kind of a fresh angle.
Sure.
Every week, and I keep thinking, who besides people already who believe this are going to give it any credit. I mean, there's almost a sense of futility washing over me, and I don't like that feeling.
I think there's some highly imperfect glimmers of optimism in Latin America, surprisingly. Millet, and he's not perfect, but that's better than Reagan and Prospera. Prospera is a charter city in Honduras that is in legal hot water. I mean, it's been the most successful and probably furthest going charter city with the prospect of being pretty extremely libertarian. I mean, it's the legal system was designed by Tom Bell to some extent, if you know his work, who's done a lot of work on polycentric law and the common law.
I've met Tom Bell.
He more or less, it's like the common law minus the parts of the common law that say, but you can't sue the government.
Good. Very good.
And the current administration in Honduras is trying to backtrack and say, no, we want to revoke the 50-year lease or whatever we gave you, and you can't really go through with this project, and they're suing Honduras, and it may end up not going anywhere, but it's interesting and promising, and there's maybe 100 people who live there currently, but they aspire to much more.
I'll have to look it up. We'll Google it. Yeah, the Millet, of course, that was a real bright spot when he got elected, and of course, things he has said since then about throwing out all those agencies and firing all those bureaucrats. I know he's got a tough time there. He only has a few seats in the Congress, and he's, the dollarization is, I guess, something he's put on hold, but maybe he had no prospect of moving ahead with it. He's got a tough time, and it may be a lesson to libertarian, would-be presidents in the U.S. I mean, what do you do once you're in? I mean, there's a question that probably doesn't get talked about very much because it seems so remote anyway. But Millet will be very interesting. I'm not keeping up day to day with him, but if I see an article in Reason Magazine or somewhere else, I'll try to see what he's up to. And here's a guy with an economics background. He taught economics. He's mentioned Rothbard. He's mentioned Mises, Hayek.
He calls himself an anarcho-capitalist. Just blows my mind.
That's really fascinating. And on the other hand, we have Venezuela, so we'll see what happens there.
Yes. Well, someone else who's talking about freedom is yourself. So where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
Well, just about everything is at the Libertarian Institute, which is libertarianinstitute.org. I have an older blog, which is pretty much a mirror image of that. It's not like I'm blogging every day, but it has stuff that I put up on Libertarian Institute too. Occasionally there's something that is not quite political in the way Libertarian Institute is. It's called Free Association, which is sheldonfreeassociation.blogspot.com. I think if you just Google it, you'll find it.
But I think you're about to say you also moved that to Substack, right?
Which has not been that active lately, and it's not political, but it's on the theological, let's say, matters. It's called The Logical Atheist. That's just the logical-atheist.blogspot.com. Just for fun and games. I'm a big fan of George Smith, who was a libertarian historian, and he was self-taught kind of in the whole range of issues. But he also wrote a great book back in the early 70s called Atheism, the Case Against God, which is a very good book of philosophy, even if you're not so much interested in the question of whether atheism is worthwhile or not. I learned a lot of philosophy from that about theory of knowledge.
George Smith is great.
I knew George, and he was quite an accomplished libertarian writer for someone who had very little formal education.
Yeah, passed recently, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's not that long ago. That was a shame, but again, in my generation, so it's we have to pass the torch.
Your blog is also you're on Substack.
Oh yeah, yes, but there's nothing on Substack that you won't find on the blog or the Libertarian.
Sure,
I'm just trying to cover the bases. I don't charge on Substack. So
I think a lot of people will probably find the accessing through Substack more accessible. So if you're on Substack, find Sheldon there.
Yeah, glad you mentioned it. Because I don't want to take traffic away from the Libertarian Institute.
Yeah, read his essays on both places.
Lots of things besides me. So if people want to explore it, see who else is being published, what kind of topics, give them a sample, see what you think of the book titles. Maybe it's something somebody's interested in on a particular topic and want to sample it.
All of that. My guest once again has been Sheldon Richman, and his book is What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. Sheldon, thanks so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.